Welcome back to 30 Days of Lightroom. We're here in Adobe Lightroom Classic, and we're going to be talking about the Effects tab within the Develop module. We're going to break down what Vignette is, what Grain is, and how you can utilize these tools and effects to make your images look awesome. So we have the Effects tab open, and as I've mentioned in previous videos, I like to work in the Develop module from top to bottom. I will do my basic toning of my image. I usually add a little bit of a tone curve. Just bump up the contrast just a little bit, make it look good. And then I'll go ahead, I will do just a touch of sharpening and noise reduction. And my effects, or vignetting and grain, if I choose to add those to my image, will usually come last. Let's go ahead, let's take a look at post-crop vignetting first and see exactly what that does to our image. Let's open a blank white image here to take a look at exactly what this is doing to our image, and then we'll come back to our portrait here. We can see if we go ahead and we turn vignetting off, we have a completely white pure image. For example, if we took an image that was overexposed or of a pure white background, and if we go ahead and we turn up the amount of our vignetting, you can see we're adding kind of these darker shadows, and we're bringing our viewer's focus towards the center of the image. So just to do a quick run through of some of these sliders, amount is fairly self-explanatory. That is how heavy or how light your vignette is. You can also go in the opposite direction and add bright white vignette to your photograph. You can see here, we can add some white corners. You may find that useful in a white studio. Let's go back to our white wall example. We'll turn up our vignette. For the sake of this example, we have some very dark corners here. We can change the midpoint, how close to the center our vignette is going to be, how round or oval or square our vignette is going to be. And then if we want to blur, soften, or feather our vignette. So that is what we're doing. That is just an example so you can kind of see a little bit better what our vignette is actually doing to our image. So let's go back to our portrait and jump into these tools a little bit more in depth. Here's our portrait. I would like to add a little bit of a post-crop vignette. What exactly does that mean? Let's turn up this vignette just a little bit, and we will go to our crop tool. And you can see when we move our crop tool, our vignette moves with it. You can see this kind of dark outer ring. Let's go to a different overlay mode so you can see it a little bit better. Our vignette is moving with our image. So Lightroom is applying the vignette after our crop. It would look very awkward if we applied the vignette first and then cropped our image, and the vignette would awkwardly take up only a part of our photo. So Lightroom applies this effect last. So as we talked about earlier, amount is how heavy or light the vignette is. You can go all the way to the left, have a very dark black vignette and some very dark corners. We're really putting our emphasis on the center of the image. We can do kind of a glowy white vignette. I don't like using this very often, but it is an option. We can change how close to the center we want our vignette to be. Again, really focusing on our subject, and then play around with some of the roundness. I like a very round and softly feathered vignette. And then I will usually go back later at the end and kind of tone down the vignette a little bit. Now we can go to our little light switch here, turn that off, turn it back on. That actually looks pretty good. I really recommend that you use a very subtle vignette. You don't want to see very dark corners here. It looks very fake. You don't want to see very harsh corners here. It's not an overlay on top of your image. This looks very, very bad in my opinion. I want a very soft feathered vignette. I want it to look very natural. And sometimes your lens will produce its own vignette and look good on its own. Some people love vignettes, some people hate vignettes, but it is just a compositional technique. You can decide if you want to use it or not to further emphasize your subject and emphasize the center of your frame. In this particular case, I think it works pretty well. So we did skip a little option here called style. So let's go ahead and talk about these styles or overlays. We have highlight, color, and paint. And these are very similar if you want to think of them like blend modes. Highlight will focus on the highlight of your image and work to preserve the highlights. Let's go ahead and really emphasize this vignette. You can see here we have this highlight tool that pops up. We'll make sure with this slider that our highlights are being preserved and not crushed in our image. You can see we are getting some kind of funky coloring in there, so we want to be careful to avoid that. Let's go ahead and check out what color priority does. Color priority really wants to make the colors look good and blend well within your image. So it's going to focus, again, on the colors of your image. Let's zoom in here. And you can see we are sacrificing some of our highlights. They're getting a little bit dark, but our colors look great. Very smooth color transitions. And then we can go ahead and look at what paint overlay does. And that just slaps a heavy vignette. It kind of kills our color, it kills our highlights, and I really don't recommend using this paint overlay. If you're going to use post-crop vignetting, highly recommend color or highlight priority. Again, highlight is going to, like it says, focus on your highlights, and color will really focus on your color at the expense of your highlights sometimes. That is the difference between styles, and that is the basics of post-crop vignetting. Let's go ahead and talk about grain. So grain is pretty self-explanatory. We have an amount slider, we have a size slider, and we have a roughness slider, and they do exactly what you would probably think that they do. So let's zoom into 100% into our image, and let's add a little bit of grain to our image. If your image looks too flat and there's not that much texture, sometimes you can fake it by adding a little bit of grain. Now this might be difficult to see in a YouTube video, so I'm going to turn this all the way up to 100. This is way farther than I would really ever turn this up in real life, but I really want to emphasize this, so hopefully you can see this in the video. Again, we are at 100% for the amount. The size of the grain, again, pretty self-explanatory. If I turn it way down, we can get some very, very fine looking grain. If I turn the size up, you get some kind of gross, clumpy looking grain. Not a fan. If I ever use this tool, I usually keep the size usually no more than 2 or 3. I think 2 looks pretty good. Let's take a look at roughness. Now, to emphasize roughness, I'm going to have to turn up the size so you guys can see it in this video. Roughness is how clumpy your grain looks, essentially. So very rough. We kind of get these clumpy, more random bits. If I turn down that roughness, we get more of a uniform looking grain. Now, if I have the option, this looks very kind of digital and static. I'm not a huge fan of that. I'm going to usually turn the roughness somewhere between 50 and 100 just to kind of get this random looking noise. Looks a little bit more like film in my opinion, and that's usually what I'd like to emulate. So we'll go ahead, we will turn down the size of our grain to about 3. That looks pretty good. And now you can see we have some very nice fine grain. Looks a little bit like some high ISO film. And then we will turn down the amount. And typically, if I'm doing an actual photo for a photo shoot and not for a video example, I'll keep my grain somewhere between 20 and maybe top out at 50 at the most. And that looks pretty good. We don't want to go too far overboard. You may want to for a stylistic look, but just to add a little bit more texture in some of these flatter areas, I'll add just a touch of that grain. So that is really the effects tab within Lightroom Classic. So I hope you learned a little bit about the effects tab and adding some vignette and grain to your image. Like I always say, a little bit can go a long way, but vignette and grain are really fun to play with. So if you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up and subscribe, share this video with a friend, and until next time, get out and go shoot.